the week is finally here, and welcome to the first day of the Brighteye Edtech Startup Festival. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Hege, and I am Head of Community at Brighteye Ventures. We are the most active EdTech-focused fund in Europe, with interest spanning the sector from the early years to lifelong learning and everything in between. We partner with companies in the early stages, supporting them in their pre-seed, seed, and Series A rounds with both investment and thematic support, where we can be most helpful. And that's where we found inspiration for this festival through all the work we're doing with you people. We've decided to keep the format personal and informal, as you can see, but there are no compromises on the content offered to you by some of the best experts in the industry, contributing this week with their knowledge and experience on a number of topics relevant to building and growing your startups. We hope there'll be some helpful conversations and connections made by all of you as well in the breakout sessions or smaller conversations. After a great start this morning in Europe, discussing sourcing talent, all recorded and to be shared, we're happy to bring on session 2, focusing on building company culture. We're sad to have 2 of our contributors prevented last minute from being here. The good news, however, is we have Jon, President and CEO at Sana Labs, and Asha Haji, co-founder at Framework, to share some of their experience and insights. Jon held a number of roles at Sana before his current role, including as CCO, and prior to this, Jon worked at BCG. Before Framework, Asha founded Founders Academy, and prior to this was Chief Product Officer at School Apply. So a brilliant EdTech background there. And I know it's also more beyond that. After the panel, we'll either move into breakout rooms or we'll invite you in the audience to raise your hands, join the speakers in Speaker View, and share your questions and remarks. So please keep them coming in the chat for review by the experts. I will try my best to take us through this afternoon as moderator, and I'm sure I can count on the support of my colleague Reese, Head of Research, and of course loads of great questions from you all joining. Please keep them coming, as I said, in the chat. We will also wrap up probably a little bit earlier than scheduled because we're a bit less people on here, but that means we've got no time to lose. So with that, over to you, Jon. Please, if you want to introduce yourself and what you're building at Sana, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing your presentation and your perspectives. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you, Hege, for the warm welcome. And hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for tuning in today from wherever you are. I'm truly honored to take part in Brighteye Ventures EdTech Startup Festival, and I really look forward to the great discussions going forward. Please let me know if you have trouble seeing the screen. I'll do my best to take us through an exciting presentation on building long-lasting rituals and culture. Without further ado, today's keynote, as I mentioned, will look at how different types of organizations, from strong mission-driven ones to more commercially driven ones, have fostered great cultures, and how these cultures evolve as the companies scale. In order to set the foundation for a good culture, we'll look at how these companies have answered the why, the higher level driver for existing with a clear purpose, mission, and or vision. And then we'll deep dive into the how companies tackle the day-to-day aspects such as strategy, metrics, processes, and values to help orient behavior when answering the why. Before we dive into the content, as Hege mentioned, I'll do a quick intro on myself. Jon Lexa, Hege kindly provided some of my background. I'll shed in some of the details as well. Previously held a few operative roles. I'm also a recovering management consultant with 3 stellar years at BCG. And my education consists of a cognitive science degree and a human complex systems degree at UCLA, and an MBA at INSEAD, where I studied in France and Singapore. My current role as president is overseeing product sales, finance, and legal at Sana. And a short note about Sana Labs, aka Sana. We're going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment, but we're landing on Sana. We're a Series A startup based in Stockholm, Sweden, a team of 50 delivering a one-stop solution for all of a company's learning and knowledge management needs, targeting companies with 500 to 2,000 employees in the Nordics. And we're proud partners to over 70 customers with an active user base growing 25% month over month. All right, without further ado, let's dig into seeing a few examples of companies that have fostered good, long-lasting cultures. I'll start by asking you all to take a moment and to reflect on what you think these companies have in common. And if the name of the session is any hint, then perhaps this is a rhetorical question. All right. What these companies have in common is that despite facing economic headwinds with the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, introduction of new anti-monopoly and data privacy regulations, finding product market fit faster than anyone else, and competing for talent in a venture capital splashed with cash talent pool, is that these companies founded between 2005 and 2010 have all managed to create a culture that, by proxy of Glassdoor's ratings, which we of course can argue the validity of such a metric, continue to be a strong and attractive place for employees and candidates. It's no small feat to see that the culture scaled with the company as it grew its product lines, employees, suppliers, partners, customers, users, shareholders, and stakeholders, giving them an incredible foothold in recruiting top talent still to this day. Now, to break down this achievement into its constituents would take longer than the time we have today, and it's so context dependent. For example, if you're remote first, the playbook for a good culture differs to being co-located. If you're a remote first company in blockchain, the playbook will still differ to being a remote first company in subscription-based home cleaning. So we can't exhaustively know how everything should work for building a great culture. We can only see glimpses into the past and use our common sense to guide future decisions. What we can do in today's session is to begin to understand how these companies provided their teams with an opportunity to believe in something greater than themselves. The companies answered an important existential question: why do we exist? And answering the why we are here is one foundational building block in building a long-lasting culture. And these companies answered the why with an ambitious and sometimes ambiguous vision, purpose, mission, aka a higher level abstraction that sets a long distance goal for the team. While answering the why, these companies also achieved incredibly strong top-line commercial performance, aside from Rivian, which we should expect to have a breakout year very soon. But let's explore how they answer the why. YouTube's mission is to give everyone a voice and show them the world. Sufficiently ambitious and ambiguous. Notice they don't explicitly tell their team how to give everyone a voice and how to show them the world. Rivian's mission is to keep the world adventurous forever. Sufficiently ambiguous and ambitious, with the added flair of also being forever adventurous. Box's mission is interesting in that it's the most specific amongst this cohort. They want to power how the world works through a single platform for secure content management, collaboration, and workflow. It kind of evokes images of a globally accessible website where you can share documents securely with whomever you choose. Nevertheless, it's sufficiently ambitious. And lastly, Block, which owns Square, has the purpose of economic empowerment. Sufficiently ambitious and dangerously ambiguous. I'm curious to know whom the economic empowerment applies. I guess we'll have to wait and see. And at Sana, we're not innocent bystanders in this game, but rather very complicit. Here's our purpose and mission statement. Now, all that's left for us is to get hundreds of millions in revenue. And what's interesting to note with all these higher level vision statements is that they set a lofty target in the distance and pose the question to the team of how do we go about solving for this? Once that grand question is set, the important part is the execution. How do we actually achieve this vision? And that's where it's equally important for companies to answer the how. Companies will typically answer the how by setting strategic goals that are time-bound, establishing metrics, processes, and values to help orient and guide organizational behavior. To give a case example, I'd like to highlight one starlet in our cohort, YouTube, as an example of a company that's retained their great unique culture despite going through a massive hypergrowth journey post-acquisition. And if you're wondering what that image is to the right, I asked DALL-E to generate a photo impressionist style of a dog riding a YouTube rocket into outer space. We have Shishir Mehrotra to thank for this visit back in time. Shishir, currently the CEO and co-founder of Coda, was the VP of product at YouTube from 2008 to 2014, and has documented many of the best practices in setting long-lasting rituals at YouTube in a post called Rituals for Hypergrowth, an inside look into how YouTube scaled. Some context to set the scene. YouTube's period of hypergrowth was when everything grew by a factor of 10 over 7 years. The company had just started in 2005 before being acquired by Google a year later during a bidding war with Yahoo. The size of the company at acquisition was 65 employees. They had 100 million views per day, 65,000 new uploads daily. And Chad Hurley, the co-founder and CEO, was caught on record for mentioning that the cultures are very similar, perhaps as a reason for justifying the acquisition. Fast forward 2 years later to 2008, when Shishir joined, the 65 employees grew to 200 immediately post-acquisition. And while the brand, headquarters, and culture was maintained at its core, Shishir described the culture as having many pirates as opposed to working as a navy. By the time Shishir left, the company had gone through most of its hypergrowth phase, 10xing the number of employees, users, and revenue. Shishir mentioned that there are three main challenges when he joined in 2008. The first being the startup, big company melting pot. The company was acquired early and had to adapt to being integrated into Google, an iconic company already well known for its rituals. YouTube had its own distinct culture and challenges, so while they borrowed many best practices, they also recognized that many of the Google rituals didn't quite fit. The second challenge was hypergrowth. As we just touched on, that period from 2008 to 2014 represented enormous hypergrowth. Every metric was breaking records regularly, and the team scaled quickly to keep up. They had to adapt to the breakneck pace at which they were growing. And lastly, the third one, an intertwined three-sided marketplace. While some businesses have natural separations, YouTube's business was very connected. You had the content creators, you had the advertisers, and you had the consumers. Changes made in product rippled quickly through the creator and advertiser communities, and adjustments made to their go-to-market model had to be synchronized with key product bets. It was quite common for initiatives to be cross-functionally coordinated with a set of engineers, product managers, content partnership managers, marketing folks, press relations, lawyers, and others. We all speak about how we should work more cross-functionally and how that should increase the problem-solving ability of our team and create a better culture, but they literally had to work cross-functionally to be able to drive their business forward. And due to these three challenges, there was constant planning and replanning as new shiny priorities quickly bumped to the forefront and upset everyone's plans. Teams complained that the process was either excessively top-down and didn't allow for creative freedom, or too bottom-up and lacked coherence and prioritization. And meetings weren't well planned, often missing the right people or the right context. Because everything was important at once, the team struggled to make trade-offs. And struggling to make trade-offs also resulted in analysis paralysis. With such an intertwined business, it was often hard to know where to go with the hard choices they had to make. After much back and forth, the YouTube cadence gradually settled into this pattern of 6-month strategic planning and 6 weeks sprint planning with weekly rituals to measure progress. Shishir mentions in his post that this was a massive unlock in productivity and alignment. And what I won't go into detail here is the massive amount of nuance that goes into this. For example, the cadence for daily meetings, the types of meetings, the manner in which decisions in these meetings were made are all details that have to be hammered out within the context of your organization. What I can say, though, is that there's a lot of value in taking some of the structures and trying to apply them to your own organization. For example, here at Sana, we've also adopted the 6x6 cadence to drive our operating model. 6 months to set bold company-wide strategies, and then every 6 weeks, we revisit those priorities and plan out the 6-week sprints. The strategy sessions typically consist of a 3-week period where everyone in the company, and I mean everyone from first-year graduate to the CEO, to the most senior, to people that work part-time, to people that work full-time, everyone in the company contributes to data and insights and beliefs and bets, identifying what they see in the market or what they see internally as it relates to our customers, our ways of working, our processes, our product, and then forming a hypothesis and the ensuing beliefs and bets as a result of that. We collect these inputs, and then that then forms the basis for our strategy. Upon setting that company-wide strategy, we break that down into cross-functional missions and metrics that the teams work in for the coming 6-week sprints. Then on a weekly basis, we find moments to build culture. And this is based on our desire to have relentless transparency. So making documents like our career ladder and salaries public to anyone in the company. We also dog food our own product every day to drive collaboration and knowledge sharing, which also provides great opportunities to give us product feedback as well. We consistently reinforce the how by integrating strategy, values, and other rituals into our ways of working. For example, sharing kudos to Sanians every week in our all hands and roundups on how they've lived our values, and providing tools such as the career ladder that I mentioned earlier, or an equity calculator and standardized one-to-one templates to provide some aspect of familiarity and control amidst the sometimes chaotic environment of finding product market fit and building a company. And one outcome for us when focused on building a long-lasting culture is that we've managed to attract the best talent in the industry, holding an eNPS score of 74 and having over 850 applications per year. And one important consideration that we've made when it comes to building culture is hiring only for roles that we really need, as opposed to hiring roles based on the status quo. For example, we recently moved into a new office. Rather than having somebody there to manage the office, we took it upon ourselves to make sure that office rituals and keeping the office tidy, these type of things were managed within respective teams. This has allowed us to remove the complexity that comes with onboarding and managing people, and keeping us focused on building and selling a product that our customers love. So to summarize today's keynote on building long-lasting culture, we looked at a few different types of organizations, from those that have strong missions to those that might be a bit more commercially driven, and those that have managed to foster great culture and how these cultures have evolved as companies scale. We looked into how these companies have answered the why, the higher level driver for existing, setting a clear purpose, mission, and/or vision in order to set the foundation for a good culture. And then we dove deep into the how companies tackle the day-to-day aspects such as strategy, metric, processes, and values to help orient that behavior along the higher level driver. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to my presentation, and I'll end it with a audience listening to a keynote speaker impressionist style provided to you by Dali.
That's amazing. Thanks a lot for that, John. Loads of learning for many of us, at least for me. And I love the Stanians. We'll keep you in the spotlight as we are proud to be joined by Asha, co-founder at Framework. Welcome, Asha. I'll let you introduce yourself as well and Framework before we dive into some of the questions that actually Reese will lead the moderating of. Take it away.
Thanks, John, for the great presentation just now as well, too. It's really, really great to see all of that outlined and a little bit of the journey from YouTube as well, too. So I'm Asha. I'm the co-founder of Framework. We're the world's first on-demand business school made especially for startup land. We are an evolution from our original business model, which was called Founders Academy, which was focusing on helping people make the journey into startup land from the traditional world of work. And we are part of a really great community, entrepreneurial community called Founders Forum, which was started by the founder of lastminute.com and made.com. And it's essentially a invite-only network, global network of some of the world's top tech entrepreneurs and business leaders. So we're proud to be associated with them. And we are focusing our efforts on helping people who are the employees of some of these rocket ship companies manage their careers effectively and have a learning community by their side to be able to navigate all the challenges that John just talked about of trying to scale a business. It's really tough. And to feel like you are with others who are on that journey and also have some frameworks, hence our name Framework, to navigate that journey is something that we think is key. And just myself, my background, I'm co-founder there. I do, as co-founder, you just do everything, right? But like, I specifically focus on a lot of our external work. So everything around growth, talent acquisition, and fundraising and investor relations is kind of under my remit, along with folks who work for us. And then just my career background as well too. I've done a whole bunch of things, but started off as a technical person and computer science and software engineering. Did my MBA at Harvard Business School, and then ended up working for a while for a big education company that's quite popular where John is in Stockholm, EF Education First. I was with them for about 7 years after I finished my MBA, and did a whole host of things with them around product and sales and marketing and talent, and then joined startups that Haig mentioned earlier about 5 years ago. So joined some market research startup started by some folks who are ex-EFers as well too, and then finally joined my co-founder about 3 years ago for us to embark on our journey to help Startup Land.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Asha. There are a few people that are better placed to talk about these things than you guys. So thank you very much for joining us. And just a reminder for everyone in the event, it's best to be watching in Speak of You in case you're not already, just because we're in Zoom meetings. And secondly, please do feel free to share your comments or questions in the chat. We'll look to get you on screen at some point, but I can certainly sort of get us started. And so, Asha, sort of, I suppose following on a little bit from John's fantastic presentation, in your experience or from your perspective, is company or organization culture something that you should be consciously sort of building, or is it an extension in the first few days? I suppose this is a question to your experience.
Sure.
An extension in the first few days of the founders and early team sort of personality and priorities and those kind of things. How do you think about that, particularly in your early days with Framework?
Yeah, I would say it has to be on purpose. Like you cannot just sort of let it just sort of happenstance. Otherwise, that is part of your culture then, that things just happen by happenstance. That is the culture you build, then it's a haphazard culture, right? So it is something that even in our early days, we've really been thoughtful about. And the reason why I would say from my own personal experience, I've experienced really great cultures and then also really not great cultures. And then seeing that contrast made me realize how I was taking for granted how great culture had come to be over, decades, right? Because I worked some more established companies and it's just like all these rituals, all these rhythms, all these, values, all of these ways of working, expectations of each other, and just all of that stuff. When you're a founder, where you're working at an early stage company, you take for granted that someone thought through all of that stuff and really intentionally put it in place. And then when you don't see it, you're like, oh, wow, okay, these things, not that you need any sort of bureaucracy, but these things about like how we talk to each other and what we do during the week, and what expectations do we have of each other, and what's our ways of working, and how does that all align with our overall strategy, and what kind of communication and rhythm and patterns do we want to create among ourselves. All of that is on purpose, like literally all of it. So I would say your best bet, if you are a founder in the audience, is to not take that for granted, because if you do, what will end up happening is you'll create a culture of confusion. You'll create a culture that's inconsistent. So some people will think things matter and others won't, and people will, have a very different experience in your company based on who they're working for, or what part of the organization. So there's going to be just all this misalignment, and I think really kind of solidifying all of that early is what makes companies have great cultures, and it's something that you can kind of hang your hat on and feel like when times get tough. And I think John can probably speak to this. There's always, as a startup founder and leader, there's always going to be a challenge that makes you question your values, or makes you question the way you operate with your culture. And if you don't have those things defined, it's really difficult to navigate through those challenges and know how you as an organization have the right North Star to get through it.
And you preempted what I was going to do in asking John what his view is on this as well.
Yeah, I share Asha's point here that it's so important to get it right from the beginning. And I think it's also incredibly important that it does happen to some degree top down. And that doesn't mean that you can't have everyone participate and partake in setting that culture. However, there's so many implicit behaviors and ways of communicating that a leader at a company or a founder at a company may have that gets picked up on by everyone else. It's just, that's how it works, right? So even if as a founder, your strength may not be in setting a culture, and you don't feel like that's something that you can be authentic about, I think it's still incredibly important to try. And if you feel like that's not where you get energy from, hire somebody that is that type of person, because it's incredibly important to get right from the start. And one story I'd like to share on how it can still be a bottom-up process, keeping in mind that there's already been some top-down structures applied, is I think about a year and a half ago, we had 4 values. They consisted of raise the bar, cathedrals not bricks, meaning, always keep that longer term vision in mind, even when you're focusing on the day-to-day tasks. Then lead with compassion, and oh gosh, now I'm put on the spot, but take ownership and move fast. All right, so that's 5. But the addition of the 5th one was lead with compassion. And for the longest time, we only had 4. However, then 2, freshly graduated Sanians who had just joined us from working part-time for a few months, then switching over to full-time, decided that they wanted to take it upon themselves to propose the addition of a 5th value, which was lead with compassion. And rather than the leadership team saying no or taking the credit for that, which is also probably not the best thing to do, we rather gave them the guidelines and the principles and let them run with that process and get buy-in from everyone in the company, even though we were a team of 20 at the time. But still, they had to go through this journey of doing workshops and getting people to provide their feedback and getting input. And that process was so meaningful for them as well to understand what it means to introduce a new value. And on top of that, then we actually then added that value to our list of values. And I think that shows how you can start with something that's top down, but then of course support those moments when people have great ideas and they want to contribute, and give them the structure, the framework, or the cadence, or the process to operate in, but then give them freedom to run as fast as they can.
So almost like you create the first framework, and then people basically can sort of fill in gaps in that framework and better define it, and it all sort of comes together to form hopefully a really happy and productive culture. And it sounds like a really it's a great example. So thank you very much for sharing it. And I suppose one element of I was going to ask about the process of defining values and mission, but I think we've kind of covered that. But one thing that is, or I'm interested in certainly, and I know, well, I hope others are too, is once you've defined those values, what kind of process do you have, or how do you make sure that you're sort of reporting against them or living up to those values? Because obviously it's one thing to have them really sort of nicely presented, have this whole thorough process, but then of course it's, in challenging moments it can be hard to sort of make sure that those values are kept to. So I wonder if you have any guidance on how to do that. And I'll start with Asha again, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say they can't just be one and done. So I think that's that's at the heart of your question, right? Is like how to avoid them being one and done. But I think it's worth saying that it's not a terminal exercise that you just sort of choose your values, put them in a book or put them in a Notion page and walk away. They have to be incorporated into different rituals that already exist, right? That then allow you to, revisit them. So in the case of, with us, and also what I've seen at other companies that I've worked at, where they were very values strong, meaning that we like always brought them up and it was like part of our lexicon, right? A few things. One, we put them on our job description so people can immediately see that and then start using that language as an attractor. They're like, oh, I love that you put that value on your careers website. I want to, embody that as well too. And again, we're very early days to even have done the values exercise, right, as an early stage startup. But I think it's something that matters to us and we prioritize, right? Then I think it is also something that's worth bringing up during performance development conversations. So in performance development conversations and performance review conversations, having that be not necessarily a marker for a rubric around those sorts of things, but at least incorporated into the conversation. Like, how much do you think, especially I personally think performance development conversations should be very reflective. There should be reflections that are happening, as a two-sided conversation, not a one-sided, this is how you did and you just receive it type of conversation. And so having people be able to speak to how much they think they're embodying some of these values, I think is a very healthy check-in, right? To say, and how do you think the organization is embodying these values? Do you agree that these are valid, right? And that we are embracing these, right? So holding us accountable as well too. Again, that sort of two-way conversation, I think also is important as well too. And I would say, I think there's also just general drum beats that happen within your organization, right? So if you're doing any sort of like quarterly, like we do quarterly check-ins as strategy days as a team, and that's even where we started talking about what we thought some of these values should be. I think just revisiting these at whatever cadence makes sense to your organization, where everybody's coming together, is helpful. And whether it's, hey, here's what our new values are, do you want to discuss them and give feedback on them? Do you think we embody these? To what I think happened with John, it seemed like someone wanted to do a refresh, right? And so the fact that they even knew that was there obviously meant that there was some sort of process where new joiners were being exposed to that, and they wanted to, feel like they could have a say in affecting it. So I would say making it something that you bring up, at least at a certain cadence when people join, as people are looking at your job, as people are managing their careers, and maybe even on your, internal comms about like how we operate and how we embody this. And then that be a destination that people have to come back to again and again. Those are, I think, the ways that you can get that language to stick.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that all makes total sense. And I wonder, John, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? If not, I can shift on to the next very related question.
One small example in line with what Asha was saying is integrating it into our all hands or in our roundups, right, as a way for people to share appreciation. So I can pick a value during the roundup and say, hey, Asha, thanks for moving fast today or this week on that customer proposal or something like that. And it's that bringing that the values into the lexicon, like what Asha was saying, that then makes it feel second nature and puts the values into practice, which is the most important thing. And at the end of the day, it should also feel authentic. So we'll switch it up like every 6 months or whenever it just starts to feel like, okay, maybe we shouldn't reference it every week. So let's find another opportunity to bring the values into the conversation, into the ways of working. And I think that's also an important point to remember, that you shouldn't do this process just because somebody says do this process and it feels like everyone's doing the process, right? You should always question the status quo and make sure that it's authentic to you as an organization. During my presentation, I mentioned the thing around hiring for roles that we only need. That's just another example of where we want to challenge the status quo. The same thing should be with values. Like, find those opportune moments that are authentic for your organization and then use the values, and don't create something new. Just use the values as a way to set a rubric.
I think just one quick thing I'll say on that, Reese, as well too, is it begs the question of like, do your values actually match your behavior, right? So I think a lot of times you see companies have a values, employee handbook or what have you list, and then it just sort of goes into a corner and you never see it again and never talk about it again. And that could just be out of, again, a lack of consistency in the culture, but it also could reflect that maybe the values are way more aspirational than they are honest about like where the company is. So it's like they wish they had these values, but they don't actually execute on them. And so I think what John's talking about is really important in that, if you're doing things that showcase that these values actually hold water, that they actually matter, and that they are the way you are operating today, right? And maybe you're not perfect all the time, but they are, in spitting distance of what your behaviors are as a culture, then it will feel natural, right? To then bring it up as part of a all hands or, town hall, and it won't seem silly or pat because it is consistent with your culture. So I think if you feel like your values, if you look at them and you're just like, this is a silly exercise, or you feel cynical about them, that probably means that there's more, work to be done on your actual culture. And that you should maybe revisit what your values truly are, because they're supposed to be a summary of the way that you operate as a business and the lens to which you look through to make proper decisions. That's the whole point. So when times get tough, you make great decisions based on your values, as opposed to just, being backed in a corner.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. I think tend to generally be very aware of over formalizing these things, but I suppose there's nothing wrong with, once you've written down your mission statement, you've got your values all set, that kind of thing, that you actually do kind of have a very specific think about where in your processes, in your sort of daily, monthly, weekly processes, etc., you can actually sort of make sure that those are being lived, just I suppose to get these things off the ground in the first instance, because of course, as you say, there is a real danger that you make these 4 things, they seem great and apply to everything you're doing at one point in time, but then you're scaling, and that's it's a challenge to maintain cultures during a company's rapid scaling, and I think that's something we might come back to. But one other thing, another key area, of course, culture is, a lot of it has to do with the people that are in your team, and cultural fit is arguably, it's incredibly important in all your hires, arguably most important in those early hires, because they're the people that then make subsequent hires, etc. But I suppose I'd be interested to know what your views are on how to make sure that someone is a good cultural fit with your organization through sort of your hiring process, because there's lots of organizations that have a culture specific interview process, that kind of thing, as well as role specific things. Are there pieces of guidance you might share on how you can sort of put that into place? Starting with John this time. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a great question. One, I think having the values as part of the interview questions is definitely good, to get examples of when a person has lived this value, and really like dive deep into those examples so that you can test whether it's just something made up or not. To have them meet quite a number of people, especially early on. I think the cost of a bad hire, everyone knows, is so much more than waiting and finding the right person. So really take the time to thoroughly vet them and have them meet a bunch of people. It can still be an informal interview, invite them to lunch to meet the team, see how they act, see how they behave, see like what share of speaking this person has compared to somebody else in your team that maybe is not as vocal if this person is very vocal. And along with that, have them meet a variety of different levels within the organization, even if you're a small team. Just, more people is better initially. And then I think reference checks are actually still pretty valuable, I find, if you do them in a way where you can kind of tease beyond like the boilerplate, like, this person is great, they work with me at XYZ, and you can get into some depth. But I'd say keeping the questions in line with like your values and what type of expectations that you'd look for in a person, and then have them meet as many people as possible. And maybe lastly, one thing that's pretty helpful is having a person on the team that is really hard to win over. Meaning they should be the person that drives a lot of the culture and stands up for the culture at your company. Typically, they're somebody who's been with the company from very early on. It could be yourself if you're the founder. It could be your co-founder. It could be one of the early hires. But you'll know this person. they're not always the easiest to please, and they really believe in your culture. Use them as like the final straw to check to make sure that you're not hiring the wrong person.
That's invaluable guidance, I think. Absolutely. And Asha, do you have thoughts on that process as well?
Yeah, I do. And I feel like culture fit is a minefield, if I'm being honest. I think it's a great opportunity to express tons of bias and to be very to be very loosey-goosey with the hiring process in a way that does not get you the outcomes that you want in the long term. So what I will say is I think it's really key to be really clear about what you mean by that. So a lot of times people think culture fit means like someone that they could like hang out with, or have a nice chat with, grab a beer with, grab lunch with, whatever. And then all of a sudden people are shocked when they think that way, that their team is like entirely one background, right? Like, and then they're like, oh, how did we get to have a diversity problem? It's like, well, you hired people that you just want to have a friendly chat with. And so instead, I think it really should go back to values, frankly, right? So that is your North Star, right? Like, what are our values? And I think the rigor that has to come in talent acquisition has to come around rubrics, right? Like, you really need to be laser focused and razor sharp on having tight rubrics around what do these things actually mean, right? Like what are you actually looking for, and having rigor around assessing people on those rubrics and evidencing that through your conversations and your interviews. So that means you can't, be really loose with your interviews where you just sort of have people chat, not really look at notes, not really look at people's CVs, not really look at, what's going on, but that there's purpose in those conversations, that you have you're saying, hey, this part of the rubric we're a little uncertain about. So can you go in and really, dive in on that bit about their experience here or their experience there. Their times dealing with, if it's a leadership role, their times dealing with something tough on a leadership perspective, or how they manage teams, how they deal with stress, this and that. And I think I completely agree with everything John said around, making sure that we get references, that you get different people and different perspectives, so you don't have any group think about this process thing. All of that is fantastic. But I think really at the core of this is culture fit can't just be, finger in the air, the someone's that I like, because I have plenty of friends who would be terrible colleagues, right? They're great people, but like they should not be working here, right? Like, and I think that has to be a standard that you have put across the organization, so that you don't get these little, groupthink biased parts of the organization, because you want that diversity of backgrounds. You want people catching your blind spots. You want to create an organization that can attract the very best talent. And if you have too much of the exact same, you're going to miss out on all of the above.
Yeah, certainly. And I think one thing that we've observed anyway is that the average, candidates know to expect a slightly longer, more involved recruitment process now than used to be the case. It's perfectly normal now for there to be kind of a lunch round type situation, which of course a few years ago would have seemed quite kind of strange, I guess, to be, one of 5 or 6 rounds. But as you say, I think part of the extension of those rounds is more down to increasing, realization of the importance of value alignment in a way that maybe previously it was perhaps a slightly secondary priority now, and certainly in young organizations, that's or startups is what I mean. That's right at the top of the list. And I suppose we've covered a little bit about sort of the extra elements of culture in terms of the office environment, kind of perks packages, all those kind of things. So I won't go into questions on that necessarily, because I think that's kind of that's effectively a rollout of the values you align. But one thing we did touch on, which I said we'd return to, is on remote teams and on international teams. And of course, maintaining a coherent, meaningful culture is challenging in those situations. You might have people that are in the office, you might have people that are working at home, you might be trying to hire new people people into a market. Maybe there's a couple of people in one new market and a couple of people in another, or potentially you're basically creating another, organization the size of the organization in your home market in one of the new markets. And the typical example is when a European company is looking to potentially start out in the US. And I suppose we are frequently asked by our portfolio companies about how they prioritize which hires to make, how they then transfer the culture that they've spent so long curating in their home market into those new markets. And I wondered if you have thoughts on how to do that, and to what extent it's a culture is sort of centrally managed and overseen versus to what extent you basically enable people to create what you hope will be a really complementary culture in the new market. And I'll start with Asha on this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think I got a great crash course in this, not working at a startup, but actually working at a company I mentioned earlier, EF Education First, because they had a really cool model where it was, big company, 50,000 employees across presence in over 100 countries. But they had a very federated model, right, where people had a lot of ownership in different markets, right? So people really felt like they were the king of their kingdom, and whatever market they were operating in. And yet, everybody felt like an EF person when we got together. Like you'd meet up, all of a sudden we're all people in Shanghai, and it's like, oh, I'm from the London office, I'm the Zurich office, Boston office. We all get together for dinner in Shanghai, and it's like, it just feels like one big EF gathering. It's the same energy, the same positivity and like can-do entrepreneurial spirit, and no matter what office you're in and what culture. Yet I did feel like everybody got to. I think what was cool about EF was that it was a company about cultural exchange. So there was an appreciation of local culture and curiosity around local culture. Like that was part of our whole ethos. So it just tied in really nicely that. It wasn't strange for you to be from, a small office in Malaysia or a small office in Ecuador, because that was the whole point, is that we were a global company connecting cultures together. So I felt like, there's a spirit behind this that you can make it work. You can have globally connected teams and create both an appreciation of a central culture around like, this is who we are, we're these types of people, and we have these shared mission and vision, but that can be localized, with leaders who embrace that and understand that ethos. And so what do I take from that lesson from EF working in a much smaller organization? I would say there definitely needs to be a lot of connection to there can't be. One thing I will say is that none of those offices felt like they were off an island to themselves. Like, no, you never thought like, oh, people in Ecuador, we have no idea what they're up to. We don't know what's going on, and they're doing their own thing. Like they always felt connected, and that came in the form of plane trips and meetings and things like that. And so there is a bit of face-to-face nature to it to some degree. I think leaders in those organizations do need to feel like they are connected to something that is central, right? Like they do need to feel like there's a buy-in there as well. And then I would say, just from our own experience, stepping away from EF and thinking kind of post-pandemic here with like the whole hybrid working model, there has to be a feeling of nobody is secondary to the central, like particularly if you create a central hub, and then you start wanting to build out another hub in a different location, or another office in a different location, you don't want to ever feel like those people in a different location are less than the people who are in central, or if someone's working from home more often than not, more remote, and then you're coming to the office, but maybe you're in the same region, that those people feel less than. And so there's tiny things that you can do to prevent that, such as like if you're having a meeting and it's half the people are going to be virtual versus you, have everybody use their laptop so that the screen is always uniquely this, versus having like one laptop on a screen of a room, so that there's like a secondary relationship. And then we would always like look into the laptop, even if we're in the same room, like we'd look people in the face so that they can see, on the screen. So there's like a parity of relationship as opposed to like looking up and talking to people this way. So things like that. And using distribution tools, right? Like, so using Notion, using Slack, using all of these things to document our experiences, as opposed to, oh, you didn't see the whiteboard, so you've missed out on what's happening. So I think there's just practices that you need to decide how what is the center of your universe? And in our case, we've decided the center of our universe is being virtual first, meaning like we will virtually document our experiences as a team. And that allows us to make sure that even the folks who only come in once a month still feel extremely connected to our mission and connected to us, as opposed to feeling like they're kind of like the second tier team.
Yeah, I understand that. It's a very interesting one. We get asked quite a lot when companies are internationalizing how they should sequence the hires they're making based on the likely fit of someone in a particular role and their ability to then create the culture that people want. And of course, that naturally the first hire is typically a country manager, but companies that do sort of opt for a head of sales first often do sort of come back to us and say, we wish we'd hired someone who was more of an operator, who would have prioritized that sort of cultural element a little bit more, of course, than someone who is far more sort of targets driven, I guess, in a way. So yeah, it's an interesting one because it kind of goes back to how you sort of measure performance against the values as well. If you sort of make it part of your framework, of course, then it sort of suddenly becomes a considerably more ingrained than it was before. But John, how are you finding that process at Sana?
Yeah, and I have to say that we're also very much inspired by the EF model. We're fortunate enough to have some ex-EFers here at Sana, and they've shed some light into how EFs worked, and it's really cool to see. So I recommend anyone who can to learn more about that. I liked Asha's point around aiming to treat everyone on equal grounds and being super aware of if there's a moment when somebody might feel like a second-class citizen to a first-class citizen. I think that can lead to quite disastrous results. So it's good to be almost hypersensitive to those type of moments. And it really does come down to the details of, are people joining on one laptop, looking at one screen, or are they all on their respective laptops? So that was a great example of how sensitive you have to be to those type of situations. I think when it comes to international expansion, we're looking and reading a lot about this. We're still at the stage where we haven't fully expanded internationally, so this is more hypothetical. But one hypothesis that we do have today is, if you look at the company and kind of list out the different buckets of like culture, value, or like values, recruiting framework, compensation ladders, feedback processes, meetings within teams. We're starting with the assumption that everything will be consistent with the respective offices around the globe. So we'll try to copy as much as possible and then deviate where we need to. For example, like sales compensation, probably going to have to change it up if we go to the US. The Swedish sales compensation is not going to fly there. But first start with the assumption that everything is the same and then start to make small deviations. And only make those small deviations if you really have to. Like, don't create a new recruiting rubric and try to keep the same one that you use in the home country. Then the second principle that we're working with is, and this model will be a bit harder, but we'll aim to achieve this, is to actually take as many people from the existing office and have them actually go and expand and build the new office, even if it's more of a temporary thing, just to establish the culture, essentially, right? They know the values, they know the ways of working, they know what type of traits to look for when we're recruiting, and that will ensure that much more of that culture then has fertile ground to then grow in the new place. Whereas the risk with hiring somebody fresh from, in a different geography is, one, you don't really know them that well. Maybe the interview was done over Zoom. Maybe you met them a few times in person. Even if you invite them over to the home office to live for 3 months and get up to speed, I mean, there's so much going on, and it's such a big risk to get it wrong. So I think we're starting with this hypothesis that we'll just aim to have a team set up the new office from the home office, then backfill here, and then hire locally as the team grows and as the business proves itself, following again the EF model of winning a few key customers, then starting to invest more and more and more. So still yet to be tested, but maybe tune in a year from now and we'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah, that sounds like a very smart approach, and I think it reflects actually what we put together an internationalization survey of companies last year, and we had, I think, 60 responses, and I think about 65 or 70% said that they would send one of the co-founders to set up the company in the new market. And that is such a it's a great way of making sure that culture and sense of priorities and place in the ecosystem is sort of reflected in the new market as well. And I suppose one element of it's incredibly competitive to make sure that you're getting the right people into your startups, and you of course want them to then stay. As lots of people have mentioned, it's incredibly expensive to go through a hiring process and then not to be able to retain people for the longer term. And so one of the sort of key components of people wanting to stay is making sure that they feel like their career is on a trajectory that aligns with what they see for themselves. And of course, in the early days, learning and development approaches aren't particularly sophisticated. If you're really early, one day you're writing the strategy and the next day you're building chairs. It all sort of evolves pretty quickly, doesn't it? And I suppose what I think I'd be really interested to understand is how you see appetite for learning and development increasing in your companies in time, and I suppose how you're structuring those approaches to learning and development, and to what extent you enable sort of ownership of individuals to choose what kind of learning they go for versus having a set of priorities that people have to work on, that's set by you. So yeah, I'd be really interested in your perspectives on how your approaches to learning and development are evolving. And I'd start with John, if that's okay.
Sure. So learning and development, and maybe I can share my interpretation of it as one way of understanding it, and I'm happy to hear others folks understanding as well. So when I think about learning and development, I think about there's this mandatory training aspect, which includes things like data privacy, GDPR, how to add your vacation days in our finance accounting system, things that people tend to roll their eyes over at. And then there's some more exciting things like, let's say I'm new to the sales team and I get to practice my pitch or my demo, and that's part of my learning and development curriculum. And that can still be mandatory training as part of being on the sales team. And then we get more into the optional learning and development, which is more borderline like knowledge management and knowledge sharing. It could be, a pinpointed question that I have on what Sana's revenue was in 2019, or what were our top customers, something where I just want to check a knowledge base. Or it could be a question like, what have been great examples of Sanians living the values when speaking to customers, things that are a bit more forward-looking, and that might be more optional. And I think how we've approached this, given that this is kind of the foundation on which we build our product, is to start with many of those mandatory trainings to get them not only like out of the way, meaning make sure that people can do them and they have the time for it, but also try to make it actually a bit more exciting and a bit more engaging, so that it's not just a check in the box exercise, but people are actually feeling like they're contributing to this. And there's loads of research that have been done on like how to build more engagement within learning sessions. And I can go on for another hour on like how we've implement this in our product and in our culture. But important thing is like set aside time to do those things that are mandatory and that you have to do, but then find moments where you can actually invite people to share things that they've learned about in a more open approach. And one example of this is, again, during our all hands, we have a section called Last Week I Learned. So every Friday morning, there's a workflow in Slack that sends out a short kind of reflection and input form. People can then share what they want to discuss. And then in the morning on Monday, in advance of the all hands, they can prepare a few minutes on something that they learned. And then they have the opportunity to cover topics such as, did you know that sharks were older than trees? or like what are the effective strategies to learning, or what's the most poisonous chemical that Russia has ever created. Random things. But the point is more that we're allowing them to have space to explore topics that may not necessarily be super relevant for the company's strategy, but at least promotes this space where people can explore, they can be creative, they can discover things that they may not have had time to learn about. And that's not taking up, 100% of their day. That's a very short amount of their day. But then once you start to build this habit and this recurring pattern, that creativity can then bleed into other things, right? Then we might approach problem solving on which go-to-market to use for a specific new market in a different way if we're more primed to be creative and to explore and to learn and to read and to share knowledge.
Awesome. That's a fantastic overview. And yeah, I particularly like the idea of deciding the various tiers of priority of training and the different types of training. And I suppose you can then sort of start to align budgets and all those other sort of infrastructural elements that are so necessary within that as well. And Asha, how do you feel about that as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with I think everything John brought up. And I would just say, I think stage and age of company will reflect a different approach to all of this as well too. So I think in the very early days, the learning, the on the job learning is probably extremely high percentage of the type of learning you're going to do, right? Because it's just constant, opportunities for people to take on responsibilities that are outside of their, normal scope of, what they've been exposed to in the past. And usually people join early stage startups because they want that. They want the chance to go on the adventure and try something new and do something that they haven't done before and stretch themselves, right? And so there will be a lot of opportunities for collaboration. And so you're learning from your colleagues and the work that they're doing. And a big part of learning comes from that knowledge sharing, that sort of saying, here's what the engineering team is up to. And because you are in that sort of two pizza, rule at that stage, right, where you can all sort of see what everybody's going, doing. And that one of my favorite equations is around comms and how difficult and complex communication can happen across teams, and relationship management can happen across teams as they scale. So the equation is n squared minus n over 2. That's the number of relationships that exist in a company. So if you have 3 employees, right, then it's 3 squared minus 3 divided by 2, right? So that's 9 minus 3, 6 divided by 2, 3. There's 3 relationships. If you see 3 dots, 1, 2, 3, right? And then as you grow, it exponentially grows, right? So once you get to a place where the n squared minus n over 2 gets crazy and it's like a really big number, then it's difficult to learn that way. And you have to learn other ways. You have to formalize it a bit more. And so you might need to have like learning programs and tools like John's or mine's, right? That you bring right to your company to help you with all of that, because you can't just ask every single person at the company what they do and how they do it, because you would run out of time. And so there needs to be a bit more structure and formality around that sort of thing to capture it, so you can spread it out more efficiently in the organization. And also, by the way, maybe not all the information you need lives in the company. You got to go find stuff from other places and external sources to help you all understand. And so I think that shifts. And then that's when you start thinking about like formal learning programs. You start thinking about like external support. And you also start at that stage, likely hiring a lot more specialists than generalists. And so those specialists are also going to want to hone their craft and get deeper and deeper into the knowledge of the work that they're doing, and find, means to get more, more expertise that they can bring into the business as well. So I would say all those elements that John brought up exist, but the ratio will continue to change as the company grows and goes in different directions.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar with the experiences of some of the companies in the portfolio, I think. And you can start off with a really nice sort of lunch and learn, but then I guess it sort of changes considerably if you're all over the world. And of
Exactly.
course, again, it's I think one thing that sort of touches on a bit is sort of the coaching and mentoring sort of side of things. And of course, we've had a question in the chat, a couple of questions in the chat, one from Leslie, which is, what role do you see for executive or team coaching in your L&D strategy? And I suppose my part two to that would be, what role do you see for coaching and mentoring in sort of, your perhaps less experienced, less senior colleagues as well? One trend we semi-expect, I think, just going off on a Brighteye tangent a little bit, but is we expect coaching and mentoring to be tied to the individual rather than companies considerably more in the future, because obviously over recently and via executive coaching and other kind of solutions, it's often the company that's paying, but then it kind of seems quite strange for a mentor relationship to kind of totally cut once someone leaves an organization. But we'll start with Leslie's question, which is, what role do you see for executive or team coaching in that strategy? And we'll start with Asha this time, if that's okay.
Yep. I think it's massive, and I actually think it's something that I would encourage startups to embrace fairly early on, I would say. Particularly at the very beginning, startup founders are taking on lots and lots of responsibilities, and the big question that they're always faced with is prioritization, what they should be working on. When there's 100 fires, which one are you going to put out first? And that's the negative way of framing it. The positive way of framing it is 100 opportunities. So which ones are the ones to go after, right? And so what a coach can do is obviously help a founder or executive leader have decision-making frameworks that they can use, that they can take to these challenges again and again, and also just manage the emotional labor of taking on so much responsibility for a young company. Oftentimes, the metaphor of a startup being like a baby or an infant is very real, right? And so you almost need, you think of how many parents have all these, like, what to do when you're expecting, and then what to do after the baby arrives, like guidebooks, right? And having something like that you can refer to navigate that sort of 0 to 1, 1 to 100, 100 to 1,000 journey, I think is really, really important. So I would say, I think executive coaching is definitely a worthwhile investment for companies as they're growing. But I also agree with you. I think executive, I don't know if it's coaching necessarily, but it could also be mentoring as well too, for all other members of the organization. And I think there is a nuanced difference between coaching and mentoring. Coaching is very much around equipping you with the tool. Like, there's very specific styles, but it's almost like therapy, right? It's equipping you with the tools to be able to navigate your own decision making. And I think earlier in your career, maybe you could benefit from coaching, but I oftentimes feel like a lot of times early in your career, you could benefit from mentoring, which is modeling off of somebody who's been there, done that, and taking some of the lessons that they've learned and then trying to apply that, because oftentimes you're just kind of like, I just really need a playbook here. What could I use to navigate this, versus shooting in the dark so much when you're quite junior is a bit tough, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, are you currently coached or mentored?
Yes, every single moment, every day. And I think I'm not being by any means cynical in the response. I think, building on what Asha is saying, there's definitely a need for it. I think it happens probably more informally and more than we're aware of. And it can be as simple as, here's a playbook that somebody else made on how they scaled their business. And that doesn't have as strong of an impact as having a personal mentorship with somebody else, but it can provide some tools and some frameworks. And I think it's incredibly important to put in that time and investment from very early on. And I think it happens quite a lot, whether we're aware of it or not. And maybe it just doesn't happen in a very structured or commercial offering. But if you think about, like, the first time that a founder goes and pitches to investors, right, they're going to get some feedback. And what they choose to do with that feedback is up to them. But that's an opportunity for the first type of coaching or mentorship. Or it could be their board, or it could be more informal mentors that they've had from school or from previous work experiences. So all of these relationships exist around us, and the knowledge also exists around us. It's just up to us to really take it upon ourselves to actually use it. So yeah, I think it's definitely it plays a massive role.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I certainly feel like I've learned a lot in this conversation. So thank you for everything you shared. It's all massively appreciated. And I suppose one final comment before we wrap up is if attendees or viewers of this in the future, because as you know it's recorded, were to take one thing away from this conversation, what sort of one thing would that be? Not to sort of oversimplify or make this a crass end, but I'd be interested in your thoughts. And at this time, we'll start with John, if that's okay.
Can I have a moment?
Okay.
Maybe. So we're at this stage where there's so much information out there of how people have done it before. And I guess one word going forward, and this is also to myself as well, that I want to live by is find the balance between searching for that answer in some framework or in what your mentor tells you, and trusting your gut and being okay with the fact that your gut sometimes is wrong, but the process of learning involves fine-tuning that common sense that you have, and that'll serve you well in the long run.
Nice.
Same question, I'm assuming.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would say the big takeaway obviously is that I think a lot of times people think culture, because that was the kind of the theme of this, right? Is, beanbag chairs and perks and, like pub crawls and things like that. A lot of times that's what culture is defined as. And I think what people don't realize is culture is the decisions you make when things are tough. Culture is what people do when no one's watching. Culture is, how people are treated in good times and bad, how people behave and what's considered okay, right? And what's considered not okay, right? And so those are the things that actually are less sexy and less, and harder to kind of to hold yourself accountable to. It's much easier to like throw money at a party and throw money at gifts and perks and things in the mail and things like that. And so I would say, if you really want to create a sustainable culture, start with the substantive, meat on the bones, right? Like, what is the real difficult, way of handling decision making and really cementing that and holding yourself accountable to that. And I think all that other stuff is icing, right? It's great. It's just a manifestation of the fact that you appreciate people, right? And you're showing appreciation for them. But it doesn't mean that will be a salve if you've got all those other things broken.
Two fantastic points to end on. So thank you very much for taking the time to pick one priority. I know it's very hard. So thank you very much. And it's been a really great conversation. I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and I hope people in the future watching this and on recording are enjoying it as well. But I'll hand over to Hege to wrap us up.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Reed. And what a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much to Asher and John. It will be very, very hard to beat this in the coming days, but we do have 4 more days, 10 more digital events, meaning a lot more to hear and to learn. So that's it for today, but please come back later in the week. And please also follow Brighteye on LinkedIn and Twitter for any updates. And thanks again. Fantastic panel. Thank you.